Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to do a somewhat topical video because the air superiority update did bring up some questions about the implementation of top tier vehicles and basically who gets the final say and what type of information is accurate, and also generally the state of the Abrams tanks in general in the game right now. So this is going to be a video kind of going over that. Now, I do have a video series that I'm kind of working on that's going to look at the idea of Russian bias and how much merit or how little merit that idea has, but it turns out that's actually a pretty involved topic, so this is kind of a primer for that because it is going to be discussing some of the themes that we'll be carrying over into it. But just so you know, that video is in the works, but for today we're not really going to be touching on those topics. Now we're going to kick things off with an anecdote because of course all good lessons start with an anecdote. Now about two and a half years ago, if you were playing the Chinese tech tree, you probably noticed that especially during the upper echelons, it was pretty awful. It was comfortably one of the worst tech trees in the game. And a big part of the reason for this actually has to do with the community coordinator position. Now, these are the positions that Gaijin has that essentially coordinate things like bug reports. Now, bug reports in War Thunder aren't always technical in terms of the game crashing or whatever. The bug reports often have to do with vehicle characteristics being incorrect, whether they be too high or too low, anything like that. The problem is these kind of positions aren't actually official Gaijin staff members. They are essentially volunteers, although I'm not sure exactly what level of compensation they get for this. Now, it's important to realize that because they're not Gaijin staff, the actual standards by which they are held to are not necessarily the same. So when you start looking at the Chinese tech tree circa 2.5 years ago, there were a lot of anomalies. A lot of vehicles were significantly worse than they should have been. Some vehicles were struggling to get implemented because of lack of information, etc., etc., etc. And all of this was happening while any bug report that adversely affected these Chinese vehicles was getting passed off very quickly. So it turns out there was a bit of a mini revolt within the Mandarin community, the Chinese-speaking community, because the individual that was handling all of these bug reports happened to have a very specific, let's say, political affiliation. They had an interest in the game that was not making the vehicles authentic and not making the best gameplay experience, to put it mildly. Any bug report that would result in a nerf to a Chinese vehicle was passed off very quickly. Any bug report that would result in a buff was passed off either very slowly or in some cases not at all. And in those cases, the bug report would be denied because they would say there weren't enough supporting evidence. Now, ultimately, this did get found out. The Mandarin-speaking community did kind of go around them. Ultimately, there was a big hubbub and they got removed. And after that happens, a lot of new Chinese vehicles got implemented. The existing ones got significant buffs. The ZTZ-96A went from a 7.5 second reload to a 7.1 second reload. The shell velocity got better, the zoom and the optics got better. They went from first gen thermals to like third gen thermals, so a lot of pretty significant updates were pushed out for a wide array of vehicles. And this kind of shows you exactly how I don't think it needs to be said that somebody actively sabotaging your tech tree is going to be a problem, or somebody actively trying to buff it is going to be a big benefit. And for me, because of this already happened in the past, and we also have the big hubbub going on right now, my general opinion is that this should be a staff member of Gaijin doing this, using an official Gaijin account that isn't linked to their personal account so they don't get doxxed. And of course, they should be held to a very specific set of standards in terms of what is and is not a valid bug report to send up to the developers, because right now there is a little bit too much personal preference involved in terms of what does and does not get sent up. And of course, all of this is a much bigger deal when you start getting into more modern vehicles, because obviously World War II, Cold War vehicles, most of those you can find pretty good sourcing on exactly how well or poorly they worked, armor penetration of shells, their armor values, all that good stuff. But as soon as you start getting into modern vehicles where a lot of the specific information is going to be highly classified, you start running into serious issues with finding quote-unquote reliable sources. So at that point, there's a lot more subjectivity into what is specifically a reliable source. And that's part of the reason why, in general, I think Gaijin should probably just make decisions that are best for gameplay and just kind of ignore authenticity for these top tier vehicles, because their stats are essentially fictional anyway, but that's just my opinion on the matter. Now, all of that leads into a pair of articles. There was a primer article that had an initial assessment that, as far as Gaijin was concerned, there wasn't enough evidence to implement the depleted uranium inserts into the hull of the M1A2 Set V2. And also, Gaijin didn't seem to think there was enough evidence to support the idea of spall liners in the M1A2 series of tanks. On top of that, Gaijin also admitted that the Abrams, especially the 120mm armored versions, are underperforming in game and they're looking for a buff, which it's kind of weird. You could just add the depleted uranium insert to the front and add the spall liner, and that would probably help, but it's whatever. This did result in the 120 Abrams getting a reload buff on a fully maxed out crew. You can get them down to all the way to 5 seconds, so that's pretty nice. But at the end of the day, this does prompt an interesting question looking at the Abrams series of tanks and why they are currently underperforming, because I feel like there's too much hand waving that goes on in the community that either the players really suck or the tanks really suck, and in reality it's kind of a combination of factors that's contributing to the poor win rate of the Abrams. That being said, there are still ways the Abrams could be implemented better that could also help their win rate. Now, the article going into a lot of the technical specifications of the Abrams and why Gaijin does or does not feel they're valid, I will link it to in the description. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. There are a few fairly weird points in there, such as they point out that in order for the depleted uranium armor to be added, you would have to reinforce the front few torsion bars, which you could do that. It's not like saying in order to do this you would have to change space-time. It's just a simple engineering change that has been done many times in the past on vehicles where the weight has been increased. So I don't really know what the point in that segment of the article was. They also acknowledge that depleted uranium inserts have definitely been put in the front of Abrams models. They're just not sure specifically which ones or how many. And this also brings up to an interesting double standard, I guess you would say, in terms of the M1 KVT. The M1 KVT was introduced to the game, and the players got, well, some players got a little bit upset that it was the regular M1 Abrams and not the M1A1. The rationale and the reason why they're upset is because the M1A1 is the only tank that was actually fitted with the KVT Vismod package, whereas the regular M1s were never fitted with it. So it wasn't a quote-unquote authentic vehicle. However, Gaijin's rationale was that the regular M1 worked better for gameplay, and the Vismod wasn't technically impossible to install on a regular M1, which this is fine. Like, I actually agree with this rationale. In my opinion, stuff like this where it's fairly minor and it improves gameplay is perfectly fine. I think the KVT is actually a really good premium. But this also creates a double standard when you look at the depleted uranium inserts in the hull, where Gaijin say the Abrams is underperforming, but also we can't give them bonus armor because we're not sure how many had it. It's like you've already admitted that you've put features that are not authentic on vehicles like the KVT, and there are several other examples. So it feels like this is a weird, like it's not exactly internally consistent, is my real issue with this argument. The spall liner thing with the T90M is kind of its own separate issue. The T90M very prominently was the first tank in the game to receive a spall liner, despite the fact that tanks that have been in the game for literally 4 to 5 years should already have had spall liners. So I'm not really sure why they made the decision internally to put the T90M at the top of the list to get one. They did push out spall liners to a number of other tanks, and I kind of disagree with this decision because damage at top tier on the whole can be a little inconsistent, and adding more inconsistencies is pretty dodgy. But the fact that the Abrams is not getting a spall liner because they couldn't confirm that it had it, and I'm not sure why they couldn't confirm it, but that's another discussion. But the fact that the Abrams isn't getting it and its shells are now going to be less consistent probably won't help its win rate at all, but that's just my supposition on the matter. Now, when tracing back some of the problems with the Abrams, it's important to remember that the USA is part of the Big Three: USA, Germany, Russia. In the game of War Thunder, these three nations make up the vast majority of the matchmaker. In a given match, there will be as many German players as there are everybody that's not USA and Russia combined, or whatever. So these Big Three are actually really important for game balance because they will end up fighting each other, and their internal balance with each other will have a big impact on the matchmaker. Additionally, because they are so popular, the average skill level of players within the Big Three are going to be lower than they are with all of the other minor nations. which is of course obviously something you have to control for when you're looking at these kind of data sets. So one thing to note about the Abrams is the M1 and the IPM1 are doing fine. They have always been doing fine. Actually, the IPM1 needed multiple nerfs. There's a reason why it's after the M1A1 in the tech tree. The 105mm Abrams have always excelled because, number one, they're very lightweight. The M1 is 55.7 tons, the IPM1 is 56.8 tons, so only about a 1 ton difference between the two tanks, which means that these tanks are incredibly light, they're incredibly agile. On top of that, they have the fast reload, which now all of the Abrams have, which is pretty nice. But their shells are good enough for their battle rating, their armor is just barely good enough that it can catch poorly aimed shots, but their real advantage is the mobility and the reload. And it's important to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the Abrams and we start discussing the balance problem with this particular family of vehicles, because the Abrams keeps the same engine. So bear in mind as I'm giving you these increased weight stats that the engine is the exact same. So when you go up to the M1A1, the very first 120, you jump from 56.8 tons on the IPM1 to 59.4 tons on the M1A1. And the only difference between those two tanks is the gun. They have identical armor, but you added 2.5 tons to the vehicle. Now you jump from M900 to M829A1, so 522 millimeters of pen to 598 millimeters of max pen, which is notable, but realistically, once you're peaking above 500, the performance of shells starts to homogenize a lot because you're basically aiming for the same weak point from like 522 all the way up to even some of the best shells in the game. So the upgrade in shell isn't really that valuable. The decrease in mobility due to the armor is actually pretty noticeable, and this is why the M1A1 actually comes before the IPM1 in the game right now. You actually get it first, because despite technically being a later vehicle, it actually performs worse, and it's worse in game. And this isn't new. The M1A1 used to only come with M829. It didn't have M29A1. That was actually a buff that it got. And we're going to see this as a theme throughout most of the Abrams, and that almost all of them have been buffed at some point. It's at least the 120s, because the 120s all needed the buffs, whereas the 105s didn't. So when you peak up to the M1A1HC, now you're at 61.2 tons. You technically add a better armor package on the turret cheeks, but it's the armor package that nobody really shoots at. And the M1A2's turret cheeks, the HC, or the M1A1HC, has basically the best turret cheek armor that you will get on any Abrams. It never gets better than this. So you have peaked at armor at this point. And the 61.2 tons, like, you're about 2 tons heavier than the M1A1, and the only real advantage you get for that is you upgrade to M829A2. So you go from 598 millimeters of pen to 629. Really not that big of a difference. It doesn't open up that many weak points on most common enemies. You're going to be aiming for a lot of the same places. So you don't really get a lot of benefit from the armor. You don't really get a lot of benefit from the new shell, but you are about 2 tons heavier. And as we discussed with the IPM1 to M1A1, this is enough to make a difference. And then we get to the AIM, which is also at the same battle rating as the HC, and the AIM is easily the worst Abrams. It goes all the way up to 62 tons. It actually has a worse shell than the M1A1, the KEW, only has a max pen of 583. Not noticeably worse, but it is kind of weird that like it manages to be at 11.3, whereas the 11.0 tank is almost objectively better. But anyway, then you get to the M1A2, still has the exact same shell as the HC, and it's all the way up to 61.7 tons. So you only add about 0.5 tons, but it's starting to add up. Then you get to the M1A2 SEP, the base version, 62.2 tons. You've already added another half a ton on top of that, still using the exact same shell. And the M1A2 SEP is probably where, like, this is where you get the break point where the vehicles start getting really bad, because you have the option to add the Tusk package. You'll see the Tusk package in my gameplay in the background, but that's more because it looks better visually, not because it's actually useful. And when you put the Tusk package on, it peaks at 65.4 tons. You are a full 10 tons heavier than an M1 with this. You have the exact same engine. Honestly, your shell isn't meaningfully better than the IPM1 in most instances and engaging most enemies, and your armor isn't that much better either, because it's mostly just the turret cheeks that have been reinforced. You get some extra ERA that occasionally stops things like stock heat rounds, but that's really about it. And then you get to the absolute worst tank in the entire tech tree, at least as far as Abrams are concerned, the M1A2 SEP V2. 66.1 tons, doesn't even have the option to remove its Tusk package. You do have an optional mine protection package. If you feel it's not fat enough, you can peak it at close to 70 tons. Still has the same engine, still has the same shell, still has the same armor. Essentially the same armor. Like, you get some turret cheek reinforcement, whatever. It doesn't matter, people don't shoot there. They usually shoot the turret ring anyway. And this is where you see the problem, is like you start off with a line of tanks whose main advantage is mobility, and they have fast-firing guns, they can get into positions easily, and their armor is just barely good enough to catch poorly placed shots. And by the time you get to the end of the tech tree, your armor hasn't meaningfully improved, you're absolutely fat as hell, your shells aren't significantly better than they were very early on. Like, what is the advantage to this vehicle over just sticking with the IPM-1 at 11.7? And this is where we get to like the real crux of the matter, and this is the same thing we saw with the British tech tree until Gaijin actually kind of saved it at the end. Because the British tech tree for a long time was complete trash because you ended at the Challenger TES, and the Challenger TES was the heaviest tank in the game and had no meaningful benefits over the previous Challenger 2s. And then they added the Challenger 2 with a better engine that takes off all of that additional armor package, the Black Knight that doesn't have any of that additional armor package, and then they added the Challenger 3P, which also doesn't have any of that additional armor packages. And that's what basically saved the British tech tree, was they added all of these tanks that had essentially the same gun and for all practical purposes the same armor, but had better mobility, and that immediately skyrocketed them. Like, the British tech tree at the end, it's not the best, but it still feels a lot better to play than something like an M1A2 Set V2 does. If you were to ask me what I would do to try and buff the Abrams and make them more usable, I mean, obviously the problem is they're getting fatter and fatter and they're not getting any meaningful in-game benefit, but if you were to look for small things you could do to buff the Abrams family and make them less frustrating to play, there are two big changes that I would personally leverage. Now, putting the DU inserts and putting a spall liner in the Set V2, honestly I think they should just do it. There's no reason to say that it can't be done or that it definitely wasn't done. It's one of those things where nobody can tell you it isn't the case, so if it kind of sucks, you might as well implement it to make it suck less. But the things that would actually help the Abrams family as a whole, number one, is the engine noise. Abrams have a very loud engine in game, and it's also very distinct. It can be heard from like way too far away. Given that the gas turbine was specifically selected for having a much lower audio profile than a traditional diesel engine, it seems very weird that they screwed this up this hard. And if you play the Soviet tanks that have gas turbines, like the T-80, they're almost whisper quiet. So like somehow they got it right on the Russian tanks, but they didn't get it right on the American tanks. Gaijin's not really beating those accusations of Russian bias, are they? But overall, I think like evening out the engine noise to be less distinct and also less loud would help it out a lot and also be authentic. Another thing is the turret ring. The biggest weakness of the Abrams is the turret ring, and all of the debates about whether or not the turret ring is accurate aside, because I don't really want to get into it, it's kind of outside the purview of this video. There's a big problem with the turret ring in that it generates an absolute ton of shrapnel every time you hit it. Like, if you hit dead center of the turret ring, 9 times out of 10 you will knock out the entire turret crew. That is an obscene amount of shrapnel for how thin that piece of metal is. And this is also the reason why a lot of Abrams will get completely wrecked by something like a 2S38, because the 2S38 doesn't have a lot of penetration, but it doesn't matter if you can just hit a paper-thin turret ring and shotgun enough shrapnel to wipe out the whole turret crew. So if they reduce the shrapneling on the turret ring by about 30%, and also cut the engine volume and made it to where it wasn't as obvious that it's definitely an Abrams, like say what they did with the T-80s, then I think the Abrams family on the whole would enjoy a nice little buff without being overpowered and without venturing into the realms of the vehicles being not authentic, quote-unquote. As it stands right now, I don't think most of the Abrams outside of the Set V2 are unusable. They're just not remarkable in any way. They don't have any real selling point once you start getting past the 105s, because once you get into the heavier and heavier Abrams, they're just kind of crappy leopards at that point. So I do think that like some sort of buff is warranted, and Gaijin have admitted to themselves that the Abrams are underperforming, and they have been for a while now, at least the 120 ones, because the 120 Abrams used to not even have M829A2. That was actually an addition when they were underperforming before in the past. So it kind of shows that Gaijin have been having problems with the 120 Abrams underperforming for a while now. But anyway, those are just my thoughts on the matter. If you agree or disagree, please drop them in the comments down below. Let me know, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed something, hope you had fun. Have a great day, everybody.